So hello there, and Bryan, welcome to our session. Bryan is from Dallas, Texas, and he is a specialist on rent. And we're going to talk today on the topic, what is rent, right? And I've wanted to do a seminar on this topic for a while and just really do a deep drill into what does that mean, rent. It is the lifeblood of our business, and we just don't talk about it. Today we're going to talk about what our business is all about, the basics of the business in terms of what is rent. And before we get started, just want to remind you that, as a firm, we're a research company in new apartment construction. We raise equity and oftentimes bring it to America. I met Bryan in America. And we are commercial real estate brokers with sort of an emphasis and a specialty on, well, first, only do apartments, new apartment construction, and intergenerationally owned real estate. So we've got a couple of seminars coming up on leasing. Free one on August 18th to introduce you to the concept of training your frontline staff. We put hundreds of people through the program in the last couple of years. And then the formal course starts on Tuesday, August 25th. Just a reminder that on December 1st is our annual conference at Toronto Real Estate Forum on apartment development and affordable housing. Okay. And next slide for the developers on this call. We have started the National Apartment Council, which is equivalent, Bryan, of the NMHC in the US. And we have our first annual general meeting, September 21 and 22 at the Ritz-Carlton. You can see some of our speakers there. We've got, Benjamin Toll, from the leading sort of economist in Canada on the topic of real estate, Sharon Wilson-Jeannot from the National Multi-Housing Council, Wendy Waters, a researcher in Canada. It's a top-notch a flight of speakers we have, and it's going to be the largest gathering of apartment developers in Canadian history. Okay, with all our sessions, Dave Price, our director of sales, is on here, and if you have any questions or any information about today's webinar, or the services and the things that we provide, or just want to talk to someone in our company, Dave Price is the guy to talk to, and there's his information there. Okay. In terms of questions and answers, it's going to depend on how time goes today. But if you do have a question, pop it into the chat box, and we'll do our best to answer it. We typically record all our presentations, and this will be sent to you afterwards. But I think it's important that you're here in real time to understand what we're talking about, and so on. So today's topic, it's really a question that I've never heard anybody ask before. I've been wanting to do it for a long time to answer the question, just what is rent? And Bryan Pierce is one of those people that's an expert on the topic of rent. So Bryan, welcome. Why don't you take it away? Maybe now and then I'll pop in with a question or two for clarification. But thanks for being here, and let's talk about what is rent.
I think it sounds like an enjoyable time.
Okay.
So for those of you who are maybe not aware who I am, my name is Bryan Pierce. About 8 months ago, I started my own company called IgniteRevs as a consulting side. But I've been doing revenue management for multifamily in the United States since 2009, anywhere from 10,000 units to 50,000 units size portfolios. Doing that on market rate, affordable, lease-up, renovation product, all the above. And so Derek and I got a chance to be talking, and we just decided that this would be a fun topic to go through. So what is rent? We're going to cover that here. We'll talk about rent, market rent, some of my own opinions. You're going to have lots of my opinions today, by the way. We'll talk about the 4 types of rents, and surprise, I'm actually going to throw in a 5th. We'll talk about supply, demand, your pricing strategy, and then, we'll cover some questions. So I think the first thing just kind of keep in mind is that rent is like a U-Haul truck, right? You're renting the space to the individual. They don't own it. They don't keep it. So how do you do that and you get a monthly payment for it? That's pretty straightforward in how most of us think about it. The next thing that we should really be thinking about, from a U-Haul perspective, by the way, if you guys don't ever check it out, every January U-Haul puts out a migration report. I like to look at it. They've got stuff for both the US and for Canada. It tells you which provinces are receiving the most traffic. But I like to look at that U-Haul report just for fun. But the next slide, really, we should be thinking about rent like a hotel, not like a landlord. And so the old way was, or is, cost based, your guest working about pricing. You kind of have an idea what you think it is. You're not necessarily paying attention more than once a week or once a month or once however long on if pricing is going up or down with things moving. So, really, from what we recommend is a dynamic approach to pricing that follows both your demand as well as your revenue goals. So, Derek, you probably got a question
Yeah,
somewhere here
but
for me.
Brian, a friend of both of ours, Tammy Shurik,
Yep.
she said, Derek, how do you fill up an apartment building? And then she said, the answer is like an airplane. Does that make sense?
It does to me because every seat, right, is an airplane. Once that plane takes off, right, that seat cannot generate any revenue for you. And the same thing with vacancy, right? Once your unit is vacant, every day that it's vacant, that is not generating revenue for you. And so there's also seats on an airplane that are more desirable than others. Are you capturing that and bringing that in? So
Okay.
market rent. So this is my love-hate relationship with market rent. If I could just be as as plain with that as possible. So one of my, let's talk. So what market rent is? It is an opinion of what the value of the apartment is. That opinion may have been a year ago. That opinion may have been when you did your pro forma. That opinion may have been something based off of last month's rents. But at the end of the day, it's an opinion. And what I've always found interesting is that people hold really hard to this opinion of what their market rent is, and become unwilling to move off of it or change with it. So, some use an idealized rent. Hey, 2 years from now, I want my price points to be here, so they use that rent. Some will base it off of their comps. I've seen some do, hey, by the end of the year, I want to be here. I've seen some do every year, no matter what, we're just going to do a 3% markup on whatever our market rent was, and that's our, last year's market rent. That becomes our New Year's market rent. The reality is that when we take those approaches to market rent, we get out of touch with reality pretty quickly, and that becomes problematic for your leasing ability.
So Brian, you're saying you should set your rent not on your opinion, but on the data you're collecting and analyzing.
Correct. And what your customer is actually renting at, because that's ultimately the information, right? That's what matters, is what they're willing to pay.
Okay, so different parts of the country have a different economy going on right now,
Sure.
right? Most of us are from Ontario. Overall, the economy in Ontario now is sluggish and rents are going down, or at best, they're going sideways. How does this strategy change? It's not just an opinion, right? We see the slowing down the economy, we see more product coming to the marketplace. How do you think in an economy that's going down or sideways versus an economy that's going up?
So there's really, I've been through all those cycles before, even in the United States, right? And so there's a couple of different approaches that I take to pricing. First off, I don't care necessarily what the market's doing. I care more about what we want the asset to do. If we're focused on rent growth and protecting rent values, and we're okay with giving up occupancy, we'll be proud on rents a little bit longer. We'll hold, will not drop. If all you care about is cash flow and having the strongest occupancy possible, then maybe I'm going to be first to the market to drop rent, but I'm also going to extend with longer lease terms so that I can lock that, a little bit below market, but not necessarily as far as it's going to slip rent in place for a longer period of time.
Okay, so I think what you're saying, it sort of depends.
It does. It completely depends.
Okay.
So, and this is where it gets interesting, because if your market rent is holding flat and you've just taken one of these approaches, like let's say 3% every year, and then all you decide to do is concess on top of that market rent to try to drive some kind of a leasing, most concessions tend to be in the neighborhood of, call it 4% increments, right? Half month free, 1 month, 8 weeks,
Sure.
whatever it might be. It's usually in 4% increments. Well, what if you could get the same velocity by making a 2% change or a 3% change? right? You're 1% ahead on your rent performance than you otherwise would have been. So for me, the concession piece gets really muddy very quickly when you have a market rent that you think, and then you start having to do larger and larger and larger concessions in order to get to the market place where people are thinking that now this makes sense to them.
All right. Okay, let's keep going.
Sure. So advertised rent. So we've talked a little bit about market rents. Advertised rents, this is what you're putting out there. It's the sticker price. I've seen some folks say, hey, we're just going to advertise the higher price point and then here's the concession off of it. My personal experience has been that usually the best price, i.e., the lowest price for the customer, draws more interest, more traffic, more web views, if you will, gives you an opportunity to sell them and then upsell them. And so, really, what you're advertising as best as possible, if it can be leaning more towards net effective pricing, I find that to be more successful from an advertising perspective.
So Bryan, today the prospect who walks in the door is pretty well educated, right?
For sure.
They've shopped on the internet a lot. Closing ratios are higher because they know what they want, they know what's out there, right? So instead of closing ratios being 10 or 12%, they're 30% because
Correct.
they're so educated and sharp. So on your webpage, if you've got a one bedroom, a two bedroom, and a three bedroom, are you putting the lowest price on there? Are you putting the highest price? Or are you putting the range of the lowest to the highest or something in between overall?
I start with lowest, right? Prices starting at. I find that
Okay.
to be most effective. And you're absolutely right, Derek. 10 years ago when we looked at these numbers, you would typically see that people would walk into three communities and then they would pick one. Nowadays, they've picked their one and maybe their plan B if they don't
Yep.
like the first choice, right? And they walk into that community, and as long as everything works out from a value perspective, i.e., what they saw online matches what they're seeing in person, they execute. So really, your website is your curb appeal now, and it's what matters most on
Hmm.
drive people in.
Okay. So generally speaking, you're going to lead with the lowest one bedroom, the lowest two bedroom, the lowest three bedroom.
I do, yes,
Okay. Not the range.
not the range.
Okay. I tell you, sometimes I used to like to put the range on, especially when we had high priced apartments, because it kind of created a whoa, there's some apartments in there that are $5,000,
For
right?
sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but I find what's more effective with that is letting your site team do that, right? If you've got a high rise that has a large price gap, why
Yeah.
not kind of do the wink of, hey, I know you guys were interested in this one, but let me show you what $5,000 is, right? Because now what they do is they have that $5,000 anchor in their head of, oh, this is a $5,000 building, but they're getting in for $2,800.
Sure.
And right there
So,
becomes
so
that
yeah, I guess the
price.
overall point is I want the renter coming in to feel proud that while they may be paying 2,700, somebody in their building is paying 5,000,
Correct. And
right?
I think
Because
sites,
it's a high-end building.
yeah.
Okay.
So let's talk the next one. So gross rents. So gross rents, right? This is kind of the whole enchilada. Um, the amount of money the tenant owes you on paper for the apartment, plus any extras before you take anything out on electricity or taxes or fixing a leaking pipe, right? So this is kind of what you are collecting before concessions and expenses. These are my
Okay.
gross
So
rents.
advertised rent is just a number that's on your webpage.
Correct?
Gross rent is what they're actually paying you.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. And then my favorite is net effective. So from a being a revenue guy, and having been concerned with, my last company, I was at 1.2 billion of annual revenue on rent side that I was responsible for. I looked at net effective rents after concessions. What is it I'm really collecting? What's it coming in? Get the free months factored in. Let's really see apples to apples what we're generating here. And so I like net effective rent because it tells me and talks to me about what am I truly bringing through the door.
So what's the difference between gross rent and net effective rent?
A gross rent oftentimes is just it's before you take away concessions, right? It's before
Okay.
any concessions or expenses. The net effective includes any giveaways that you're doing. It might be like a 1 month gift card, or groceries or whatever else, free parking. But I include all concessions in as part of my net effective
Yeah,
calculation.
but is the theory that the concession will burn off and in the second year it won't be there?
I've seen, as an industry, we say that to ourselves a lot.
Sure.
My experience has typically been when I look at the data of who stays and who goes,
Hmm.
people who've received a concession are usually more likely to turn over and chase the next concession.
100%.
And so, yes, it works to get the door filled today. Does it create a potential problem down the road a year from now? Maybe, maybe not, right? Depending on rent control and how you want to play the game with raising those rents on new leases. But if you're trying to maintain the stability of a building, I find that the more you offer concessions, the less stable you tend to end up being.
Okay, so I hope everyone's hearing that. What Brian is saying is that when you offer 1 month's free rent or 2 months free rent to a prospect coming in, on the back end, a year later, they are more likely to move than if you offer, let's say, $1,833 to someone just up front, like no concession, just I've lowered the rent. They're more likely to stay. So concessions, yes, open up the front door, but they may also open up the back door. That's what you're saying, Brian.
Yeah, that's been my experience with data and what I've seen.
Sure. And intuitively, I don't keep track of things the way you do with data, but that's what I'd say our experience has been. Concessions bring in transient people.
Correct.
Yep.
They
Okay.
also tend to bring in more bad debt as well.
So if you have 100 people that you've given a concession to and 100 people you haven't, right? The concession people have more bad debt.
Typically, yes.
Interesting,
And they're
interesting,
more
but it's just
and or they're more
logical you say
likely
that.
to not pay, right? They'll take the concession the first month, not pay, then you have to go through the eviction process.
Yep. Okay. Okay. So net effective rent. Okay. Keep going.
Yeah, and then total revenue, right? So this is minus your concessions, minus your expenses, plus, obviously parking spots, storage locker, pet fees. That's jurisdictional. I know in Ontario you guys aren't allowed to do that.
Sure.
But total revenue is really looking at all collections, right? If you have a resident who is paying you two parking spots at $150 a month,
Hmm.
and they're paying you a very substantial rent amount, in my mind, that resident becomes more important than somebody who's not doing those same activities and is paying you, right, a minimal amount. So I like to try to keep the people who are paying the ancillary incomes or revenues as well.
I think that's a really important point. It's the total amount that they pay you, not just what they pay you in rent. That parking can be pretty significant if they're renting two spots, and our rates are 150, $200, let's say, right?
At the end of the day, it's what you keep.
Yep. Okay, cool.
So then I'm just kind of throwing in a fifth surprise that I find that most people don't think about is their unit amenity rents. So this is obviously baked into your base rent or your market rent of the unit. But realistically, I've found that anywhere from 3 to 15% of a community are the unit amenities. So flat garden style community, several buildings spread out, typically call it more around 3% to 5%. Mid-rise type of product, usually generally it's kind of that 7 to 10%. High-rise product, 10 to 15% of your community is typically based off of the views, the direction you're facing, the floor level elevation that you have. All of those things have a premium. And so, if, for example, you're charging the same thing for a 10th floor and a 15th floor, you're missing out on an opportunity, right? And there's more rent to be there and to collect.
Okay, so when you're talking about a base rent, and
Yep,
if you use this unit amenity based on the location, the view, the layout of the unit, the preferential layout, and so on, you're saying that difference in the base rent and this new rent is from 3 to 15%.
correct. So you
That's
can say, oh,
monstrous. That's monstrous.
it is. It's huge. So you can say, oh, my two bedrooms, $2,000 is the base rent. But as you move up the stack, as you have a different view, right? or location further closer to amenities or elevators or whatever it might be, there's value there. There's perceived value, either positive or negative. And so as you're able to capture that perceived value, you actually end up with more balanced leasing. And what you don't end up doing is leasing your least expensive units and then sitting on your most expensive waiting for them to go.
Okay, so Brian is doing some work. Is doing some work for us on a building that we own in Indiana. It's being leased up. It's a three-story walk-up garden, plain Jane building. Okay, one is just good. I call it luxury workforce housing. So when he's working with the property manager there, he said, "Look, I think you can get a premium between the road view and the courtyard view." So the courtyard view looks at the pool and a slightly nicer view than the courtyard view. So Brian, how much courtyard view and the road view worth? Like how'd you think through that scenario?
You look at, for me, I look at so you have to break out your units and say what amenities are on each of the units. Then you're looking at exposure to see if there's a story there or not. I prefer to look at days on market, which is a leasing velocity metric of when was the unit made available versus when did somebody actually take an application on it. Works a lot more for a stabilized building than it does for a lease-up building. So usually we tend to look at more exposure on that. I like to do a statistical t-test on that data just to make sure that there isn't an outlier that's skewing everything, right? That the data is actually telling the right story. But yeah, you start to look at it very quickly and you can see, like Derek, we were talking about that building, between the first floor and the third floor, there was a significant difference in what people were choosing to lease. Courtyard versus road. There was a difference when those were available, present in the same building, that people were pivoting towards courtyard versus road. So in that case, we were able to do, then we test it, right? We start off with $10 each way. So minus 10 for the road, plus 10 for the courtyard. Then we begin to monitor how the public responds to those price points.
Right. So when you do minus 10 and plus 10, there's no more revenue to the building, but you're probably increasing leasing velocity by pricing them appropriately.
I think there is more revenue to the building because of the velocity, because you take less vacancy,
Right.
right? Leasing becomes random, and I think that's something that we'll talk about here in a little bit. But
That's a good point. Yep.
yeah,
I've never thought about it being that high, but 15% is monstrous. If you can get a difference of 15% between what the best and the worst unit, let's say, of the same type.
yep,
Okay. Oh,
yep, for sure. So numbers that I watch very closely, you all probably do the same, but just in case, as a reminder, it's all about supply and demand, right? At the end of the day, you're trying to balance supply and demand. All pricing software, Excel sheets, whatever you're doing, you're trying to balance supply and demand. And the two proxies for those are exposure for your supply proxy. How many units are available to rent in the next X number of days? And there's different metrics we like. I like a 4 week, I like a 60 day, I like, kind of total. I also like to see vacant. And then the other proxy I really like a lot is leasing velocity, which is how fast your units are being leased at your community. Some people do this, as a percentage of total units. I personally like to do it as a percentage of available units.
mhm.
That way, it doesn't matter the seasonality of the time of year, right? The base is always relative to what seasonality is. And so I like to look at, are we getting in the last 7 days 15% of our availability moving? Yes or no? If yes, maybe an opportunity to push price there.
Okay. So what you have the bottom there, you say when exposure is high, I mean, you've got lots to lease,
It,
and velocity is low, you're saying
Adjust
lower
your
your
price.
price.
Lower your price, right?
And
Because
the
it's
opposite is when exposure is low and velocity is high, raise your price.
correct.
So what you're really saying is get ahead of it. Don't
Correct.
react. Be proactive. Look at the trend.
Correct. Because if you're waiting for occupancy instead of exposure, occupancy is a lagging indicator,
Yes.
right? They have to have already moved in. Whereas exposure is forward looking, it's
Yes.
what's coming at you. Um, and so I like to look at forward looking and not lagging indicators when I'm making price
Right.
decisions.
So set your rent on forward-looking indicators, right? Which
Correct.
is your exposure. not where you currently are. Hey, it's a Wayne Gretzky line. Go to where the puck is going.
A it's a good ice hockey analogy for sure.
Okay.
And then, the question often becomes, well, Brian, how do you know if your rents are right? The real test of that is that leasing will be random. And this is what I mean by that. Someone comes in looking for a one bedroom. How many times have you heard, or if you ask the site team, hey, you've got these two one bedrooms, which one are they going to take? And the site team will usually say, oh, well, they'll take this one, they'll take 101 because of X, Y, and Z. That's a preference. There should be a price difference. That's a unit amenity difference that you should be thinking about. What you really want to be able to do is they come in, and because this one's priced a little bit higher and this one's priced a little bit lower, do they take the little bit nicer one or they take the little bit less nice for one, right? That is random. Really, if you can't predict who leases, which unit, and why your rents are right, and I have a comment in there for right now, right? Because markets are dynamic, they're constantly changing. Things that are important to one person are, maybe less important. I tell you, outside space in the summertime, probably more valuable than outside space in the wintertime.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
you should also be thinking about that as your pricing strategy is, do you allow your units with that outside price or the outside area, space, yards, balconies, whatever it might be, do you also line those up with your seasonality? And you also price them accordingly
Okay,
based on.
really, 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 really thing. So let's say we've got extra large balconies or terraces, right? What you're saying is when you first lease those up, whatever month, you get certificate of occupancy on, time it so that when the lease comes due, it's in a good summer month because people will think about a balcony. In December, they're not going out there, right? It's too cold, there's snow there, so they're not seeing the value.
Correct.
I
That
think
that's
that's a
correct.
real, I've never thought about that strategy before. I mean, I thought about don't have your three bedrooms come due in December, have them come due, during school season or something like that, right? During the summer. But I haven't thought about balconies like that. Interesting.
Yeah. So again, days. How do you measure it? You measure it with days on market. When has someone moved out or given notice versus when has someone applied? That's the days on market metric. And then make sure you're doing a t-test on it, because I've seen data where you're like, oh, it just looks like there's this great number, but when you do a t-test, it's like one or two outliers have thrown out all the numbers on
Well,
it. So
Brian, what was a t-test again?
a statistical t-test.
Yeah.
So you're just doing a test to make sure that the data is appropriately grouped, that there's that all the data is telling the same story, and it's not a couple of outliers causing an average that's way off.
Right. So you're segmenting your data more than just taking averages.
I am,
Okay.
yes. And I'm also looking at views. I'm looking at floor levels. I'm looking at any kind of preference, positive or negative, and trying to
Yeah.
capture that so that I can have a balanced leasing. So if you're doing it kind of on your own, there's some rules that you need to live by. I would say these are the seven most I find most important. Know your market rent. So, and really kind of what I mean by that is, what is your real market rent, not what's on your financial statement. What is the market really willing to give you? Track your exposure and do it daily. Don't be
Mhm.
afraid to make price changes daily as necessary. Make sure you're measuring leasing velocity, right? If you're only looking at supply and you're not looking at demand, you're missing half the problem.
Yeah.
Have to measure your leasing velocity. So leasing velocity goes with exposure. Price every amenity. There's individuals I talk to who are like, I just love to have a really clean, here's a base rent, here's one or two amenities, and it just looks very clean. The reality is, I have found, right, that money is made on the increment on incremental revenue, those preferences, those changes. So price every amenity. If it's a first floor, second floor, third floor, have each one of those in your system. That way you can actually look at them, and you're not saying, well, this second floor is base, so those don't matter. No, you want to be able to break them out so you can actually see and confirm that second floor really is your least desirable. It may not be true. So price every amenity. Make sure you're calculating net effective rent, right? Great that you have a $2,500 market rent. You just did a 3 month concession and you're telling yourself that that's going to burn off. Eh. We'll see.
Yep.
Uh, Calculate the net effective rent on that. The other thing I'd say is make sure you're not copying your competition. Just because the market is moving up in rent, if your building is not in a place to do so, don't. I'd
So,
say the flip
but
side too.
never, but Brian, this is a pretty big statement to make because the way you typically set your rent is do a market survey and set your rents based off that. So you're copying your competition. So I've seen entire submarkets wrong, or entire submarkets where they all got the three bedrooms wrong because they're so busy copying each other.
Yeah, I've seen the same thing. And really, at the end of the day, what matters is what's happening at your own building, right? If you have if you've done a better job with customer service than your
Mhm.
competition has, that should give you an advantage in price, and you should be able to push rents because of that. It doesn't matter what the market's doing. It matters that you provided a better customer experience than anybody
Mhm.
else did. The
Mhm.
same thing would be true as if you have a strategy to be full on three bedrooms, then be full on the three bedrooms, right? If the market's moving up and your strategy is full, you don't need to follow your competition up there. It's good, it's informative, it helps, it's part of the conversation, it gives context. But at the end of the day, what matters most is what you're doing, because that's what translates into real rents for you.
Yeah. So the market survey is one of the pieces of information you use. It's not the only piece.
No, I rely more heavily on exposure and on my own velocity than I do on what the market's doing.
Very interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and then finally, just continue to review and adjust, challenge your own assumptions. Something may be true from 2 years ago that is no longer true. I'll tell you one of the things that we saw in the United States was that seasonality in the US shifted a full 30 days earlier in the year because of COVID. So whatever happened with COVID thinking, or all that, no one leased for a period of time and then they suddenly did. We've actually seen consistently since COVID 2020 that leasing seasonality has shifted a full 30 days to 45 days earlier, depending on the market in the US. So just because something has always been true doesn't mean it will always be true. So continue to review, adjust, challenge your assumptions, look at your data.
Okay. And you will see that on your tracking exposure daily
Yeah, you'll
kind
see
of
it in
thing.
traffic. You'll see it in your leasing velocities. You'll see it because
Mhm.
typically inflection points in the year, right? There's usually an inflection point around mid-March, kind of around, call it beginning of July, and then towards the beginning of September, typically are the inflection points. So what you're watching is how far before does that traffic start to pick up. And remember, most people move in, at least from my experience, about 25 to 35 days before. So that traffic shows up 25 to 35 days before the actual move-ins begin to occur. So watch your
Mm.
traffic. Yep. And it's showing
Okay.
up. And when I say here, let the computer figure out supply and demand. Really, what I mean is your data, your model, your Excel spreadsheet, your software, whatever you're using, right? Pick pick how you want to drive this, what works for you, and then stick with it. Watch your vacancy rates, look at your new rental listings, your days on market, and your demand and immigrate and migration signals. So those are kind of some larger pieces, but at the end of the day, be focused on what the property is doing, have a forecast of what you expect, and then as you either achieve that forecast or fall short of that forecast, adjust.
So a lot of times, Brian, if I go back to this, let's say we're talking about a new building. You set your target rents, right?
Yep.
And if you set them too low, you just think you're doing a good job on leasing. And you're not. You just set them too low or the market's changed.
Well, that's true. And in Canada, that's especially difficult because if you've set them, if you have a cap, right, on people who are already in the unit, then what ends up happening is you've left revenue on the table, not just in year one, but now in year two, year three, year four, because you're only allowed to increase your
Sure.
rate so much, right? So yeah, you need to get it right to start with. And you have an assumption and you do the best you can to get it out the door the correct way. But if you're not continually adjusting, especially during a lease up, you're looking at locking in rates that potentially are going to impact you for
Yep.
years on end.
Yeah, 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 100%. I think that's important for people to hear that. Okay.
Yep. So I'm not a fan of copying the guy next door. Everybody in the market's offering concessions. That's nice. But do I need to? Some my leasing team might be like, yes, we need to. Well, or is it just we need to pivot our leasing training so that they're more familiar with selling net effective pricing versus a concession-based price? Trust your data. If you have data showing that a leasing associate is not converting as well as another, trust that. If you have data that's showing that your tour ratios or your traffic ratios or your leasing ratios are high or low, take advantage of those, and then just keep adjusting. Don't sit idle with just, hey, the price is $1,500. It's always been $1,500. It's going to stay $1,500. You're missing out on vacancy.
Okay. All right. So rent setting is a dynamic process.
It definitely is
That's what you're saying. Okay. Okay.
constant. One of the things that we do, for example, and Derek, you've seen these reports before, but we look at from a lease-up perspective. I've had people ask me, I don't know how many times over the last 16 years since I've been running revenue management departments, can you do revenue management or revenue management principles on a lease-up? And the answer is absolutely you can. You want to walk beside it, not necessarily just do it only in the software system. The walk beside are some of the things that you're seeing here. We like to look at inventory, specifically exposure. We have some kind of an expectation of when our pro forma said people are going to move in. Are we on pace for that or not? Based on what our known move-ins are. We're looking at how fast certain buildings are leasing or floor plans or floor levels. I like to look at exposure at the property, bedroom count, and at the unit type levels to see where things need to be tweaked. Sometimes we think that certain two-bedroom is going to be really desirable. Turns out not to be true. So you can pivot from there. Expiration management. This is so important. We look at expiration management as we're going through side by side with folks on a lease up, because what often happens is they just look at the total for the property and they're not necessarily looking like bedroom count. And so there's some kind of an expectation that you have, and you can actually start closing down certain months so that you don't get overexposed in those periods for what you want. I like to have some kind of a forecast on that velocity
Right.
management. Oh, go ahead, Derek. No, maybe not. So for velocity management, are we getting the leasing that we were expecting versus the pro forma? I like to have some kind of hot, cold metric where we can say, okay, we need to potentially look at price decreases or additional concessions or pushing price and reducing concessions. And then at the end of the day, performance management, I like to look at what's happening each week, leasing ratios, traffic ratios, as well as tour ratios, and then break those down by bedroom count, and then take a further look at economic occupancy of the actual unit types that are going on. So yeah, so if you've ever wondered, can you do revenue management? Yes, you can on anything, right? You just have to have an expectation, and you have to have, well, there's actually 5 key things you have to have for revenue management. Hotels have them all, apartments have them all, but basically it's future interest, people who are different terms that they want. You have to also have it where it's not easy to add additional product. And so if you've got those drivers, you can do revenue management and revenue management principles on anything.
Cool. And I mean, other industries do it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you're seeing it with golf courses, right? So, or spas. People, cheap, more expensive tee times in the morning, or at the more desirable times of day versus the others. Spas do it with, hey, we've got, this is the most desirable time of day. So if you come in a little bit earlier or later, you get a better price point. It's all revenue management. It's all the same concepts.
I didn't know that. Give me a couple of other examples. I didn't know spas and golf courses revenue. I thought just whoever got there first booked the tea time. So no, but if you want a great tea time, you pay more.
Yeah, yes. Like for example, if you go golfing in Arizona, you can absolutely expect that you will be looking at a more expensive tea time and a cooler part of the day than you are in a hotter part of the day, for example.
Interesting. 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 Okay. Okay. Glenn, one of the people asked, and I think Carolyn responded to it, this says, what do you do when rents of an existing tenants is slightly higher than available units coming to the market.
Yeah, so I've done a lot of research on this. And if you ever pay attention to the public REITs in the United States, you see it in their data as well. What you actually see are larger renewal increases than you see new lease increases in the States. We've had a pretty flat market the last, call it 2 years. Things have been
Right.
pretty difficult. Um, the reason, what I have found is that you can typically get a 2 to 3% push on someone who's currently living there above market rate. So, for example, if someone's paying 1,000 and the price on that is 950, you could
Like
probably,
someone's paying $1,000 in existing rent. The guy
yep,
across the hall moves in at 950.
yep.
What do
You
you
could,
do when this $1,000 guy's rent comes due?
I push them 2 or 3%. I make
Yeah,
my
God bless
two or three
America.
percent
Okay.
higher.
Yeah.
The reason for it is that people who live there are typically sticky,
Hmm.
right? And I found that about a third of the people who get an offer just take the offer, right? They're used to seeing minimal increases because of statutory regulations, or just in their mind, they're, hey, I just expect that. Then you have the other portion who are going to be like, well, I want to negotiate. Okay, well, now come in, negotiate, but I still got my increase on that portion of individuals, which then push my revenue higher and my cash flows better.
Yeah, and I think that most of us today are finding ourselves in that situation where the market is flat and you are charging a lower rent to the existing, to the new resident coming in than the existing resident was paying. But you're saying if that's the case, go ahead and take a rent increase. Okay. A third of them are going to just accept it. Some
Yep,
are going to move anyways, and some you might have to negotiate with.
correct.
Yeah.
Probably about a third are just going to take it. A third are going to move no matter what you do, right? Just life circumstances, broke up with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or job change, whatever that might be. And the other third are going to be the ones that you can have an influence on with negotiations, price, talking with them.
Right. Kevin just asked a question I thought was interesting. I've never thought of this before. What size apartment building, unit wise, like 10 units, 20, 100 units, is it worth to conduct revenue management or revenue assessment on?
I think you can do a revenue management on any size of those buildings, right? Obviously, the more data you have,
Yes.
and data density, the better result you're going to get. But you can certainly implement principles of revenue management on any size of a building, as you're going through. Now, if you're trying to do an analysis of a building, I think really that's up to the individual and what they think
Sure.
they can get out of it. But my experience has been there is always money available, that when
Right.
you start to do the analysis, that there's opportunities there.
Right. But the bigger the building, obviously, the more data is, the more graphs you can draw, the more trending
Yep.
you can see. But if you
Yep.
own a 10-unit building, you just have way less data than a 100-unit building. But as long as you get, what, 3 points, you can draw a straight line.
Yep.
2 points, you can
For,
draw a straight
for,
line, right?
for true. The other thing that I've seen too is, we had my last company, we had three buildings that were in New York City, downtown. Matter of fact, ultra high rents. The property had been on the show Billionaires a couple of times. The team had done what they went through and they decided what market rents, and the building stalled out at 88% leasing, or 88%, occupied.
Sure.
Brought my team in. We actually reworked the entire rent roll. We looked at these preferences and premiums. We actually started adding things, balancing the building. And what we ended up with doing is driving the building to 95, 96% occupancy from where it had been at 88. Just by doing, and we weren't giving up gross potential rent. We were just rebalancing based off of what we were seeing for preferences. And so, if you have a number of buildings that are right by each other, for example, and you feel like you're always just cannibalizing one for the other, there's
Yes.
probably an opportunity there for a real revenue assessment. If you have a building where the most expensive units always seem to sit,
Yep.
probably an opportunity there. And again, the opportunity may not be on more gross potential rent, but if you can have a more balanced occupancy, if you can have a more consistent leasing velocity across the board, regardless, right? Then you
Well, then
may.
you're going to have less vacancy and make more money.
Correct.
So
Correct.
sometimes when you drop, let's say you drop a rent 50 and you raise another one 50, it's revenue neutral, but it isn't. It's occupancy advantage by doing that. I
Correct.
hope everybody gets that.
That's correct. So it may not make a difference in GPR or your rents, but it will make a difference in your revenue.
Right. Okay, great. No, fantastic. Okay, so we'll just go to. So I think that pretty much is the presentation. I think that it's just really you have to stop and think harder about rents. That's really what you're saying, right? And this as simple as plotting your exposure as opposed to your vacancy. Big picture, you're looking at job creation, you're looking at population growth up and down. What about when municipalities make projections? Do you use those at all, or is that too far into the future?
I'm, whether it's a third party data provider, or where there are, to your points, municipalities coming out and saying that they projections. When I'm looking at pricing, I'm considering the next 90 days, what's happening here and now, and what can I
Right.
take advantage of.
Okay. So you're looking out 90 days.
I am. The other stuff is informative, and it may impact a longer term strategy on whether I want to
Sure.
have longer leases or shorter leases, those kinds of things. But yeah, next 90 days is where I keep my nose pretty diligent.
Okay, all right, that's interesting. Okay, so there's a question here from France Lapine. In the United States, are there markets where the municipal taxes are above and separate from the base rent? I'm not sure I understand it. Can you see the question there, Brian?
Yeah, so um, there have been some where there are sales tax that maybe gets added to the price point, but usually the buildings themselves pay a real estate, right there, whatever the real estate taxes are is the real estate taxes for the building.
Hmm.
Now those will go up, and obviously the more they go up, the more they eat away at your NOI. But yeah, not usually above and beyond in terms of taxes, other than the
Hmm.
real estate taxes. Sometimes I've seen sales taxes, but not very often.
Okay, cool. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, Brian, I think that brings us to the end of the session. If there's no more question, we'll wrap it up. Thank you very, very much for being here. I think it's a topic that just requires more thought, more planning, and I've taken away a few concepts from here. Thank you, Brian.
Appreciate the time.
All right, great. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us.